Okay. All right, friends. This is a prayer that I'm particularly fond of. It's attributed to Sir Francis Drake, the explorer who defeated the Armada, blah, blah, blah. Um, I don't know if he actually wrote it or not, but he gets credit for it. But I think the sentiment is good for us, especially in our days after All Saints and the feral Episcopalians blog post and all of that. So let us pray. Disturb us, Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we've dreamed too little, when we arrived safely because we sailed too close to the shore. Disturb us, Lord, when, with the abundance of things we possess, we have lost our thirst for the waters of life. Having fallen in love with life, we've ceased to dream of eternity. And in our efforts to build a new earth, we have allowed our vision of the new heaven to dim. Disturb us, Lord, to dare more boldly, to venture on wider seas where storms will show your mastery. Where losing sight of land, we shall find the stars. We ask you to push back the horizons of our hopes and to push into the future in strength, courage, hope, and love. Amen.
Amen.
That one always pinches my toe a little bit, so I share that with you. All right. So, just a quick recap of where we were last week. So, Howard, we are in chapter 9, or we're just finishing up chapter 9 of Mark's Gospel, and we'll move into chapter 10. We're going back to talk about a couple of lingering verses that were perplexing to us last week. But I thought I would kind of set the table as to what we've been talking about a little bit. So last week we talked about this question about what were the Jews looking for in a Messiah in the first century. And we talked about how the Messiah literally means the anointed one, like a king, one who has been set apart with a special mission, a mission from God. And there were some expectations of what this Messiah might accomplish, including rebuilding the temple that had been destroyed, ending war, ushering in a time of peace, uniting the people, and also this signaling of the end of the world. And in Mark's Gospel, we've been talking a lot about the apocalyptic vision, which, we hear that word apocalypse and we tend to think about, apocalypse now when everything's blowing up and all of that. But the idea of apocalyptic is really that something has been hidden that's going to be revealed in the fullness of time. And specifically, the goodness, the power, the glory of God is going to be made manifest at the end of time. And that's meant to be good news for those who've been oppressed, for those who have no power, for those who have no rights, for those who are burdened economically. This idea that God is going to set things right in the fullness of time. So there's this tension throughout Mark's gospel that something's coming, and we're at that pivot point in the gospel right now where things are starting to heat up a little bit. So you've joined us, Howard, at a really interesting time. I mean, it's always interesting, but in the scope of our study of this particular version of the life of Jesus, this is when things really start to get interesting. Does anyone want to add anything to that? That was a very quick overview. I would love to hear what you all want to chime in with.
Well, Patty, just a quick question. On the first bullet in 33 AD, the temple is built, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then gets destroyed in 69. But so I don't know. At least in Jesus's life, he was not coming to rebuild the temple.
Right. Yes. And
Express that.
what's that, Elin?
He did express that he could destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3
Yes.
Mm.
Exactly, and which gets him into trouble. People really question him on that. So that's absolutely right. What you said, John. And, there's some question, is Mark's gospel written right before the fall of the temple, right after the fall of the temple? But so this whole question of, restoring the proper place of the house of God, we can say it that way, which you could even read that sort of metaphorically in terms of the coming kingdom of God. So that's very helpful. Anyone want to add anything else? Well, I just also want to revisit the same quote. I use this a lot, but particularly now in Mark's Gospel. And N.T. Wright, who is the commentator I read a lot for Mark, he talks about a war going on. And yes, we can think about the Jewish war and all of that, but also he talks about it more cosmically as the war between God and God's enemy. And the people in Palestine are on the ground in the midst of that. So C.S. Lewis, in his wonderful book, Mere Christianity, describes the coming of Jesus and the coming of God's reign on earth in this way. He says, enemy occupied territory, that is what this world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed. You might say landed in disguise. And if we think about how Jesus does not come with any of the trappings that people expected of a Messiah, so Jesus lands in disguise and is calling us to take part in a great campaign of sabotage, which I love that whole notion. It's countercultural, it's disruptive, and this idea that humans are called to partner with God, to be co-creators with God in bringing about that restoration that we were talking about. And so we'll hear that more and more as we move forward in Mark's Gospel. So I promised John last week that we would go back and talk about salt. So if you remember, at the end of Mark 9, there were all of these sayings that kind of seemed like they were cobbled together. And in fact, N.T. Wright says that this probably is a place where Mark is editing together, curating, redacting strains of Jesus tradition that are circling around in the first century. But we get this whole series of things, and it ends with teaching about salt. So I'm just going to read these last two paragraphs from Mark 9, and then we can talk about them a little bit. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were hung around your neck and you were thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than to have two hands and to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than to have 2 feet and be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than to have 2 eyes and to be thrown into hell, where their worm never dies and the fire is never quenched. For everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness, how can you season it? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. What the heck is Jesus saying there?
A bunch of different topics.
Yeah.
Like I can understand the first one. I quote it to myself frequently when I think about leaders and pastors of mega churches and just the great lie. But that does not connect logically with the next 3 examples.
Right.
So those are all by themselves, and then their worm never dies and the fire is never quenched. My edition of the Bible adds that to the other 2 examples. But then another logical jump is for everyone will be salted with fire. Now, here my question was, is that the same fire?
Hmm.
Or what sort of fire is it? I mean, I can see salted with, because that kind of will be, when you salt meat, it preserves it. It
Mhm.
becomes a thing that will last. So what fire is it that does that to people?
Great question. So, in addition to being destructive, right? Obviously, fire is destructive. We know this. What else does fire do?
Cleanses, according to some spiritual disciplines.
I missed the first part of that sentence, Fred. What'd you say?
Cleanses.
Cleanses. Okay. Cleanses, purifies. Yeah.
Could be a sacrifice too, at least to the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm. 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 In this context, so, and I totally agree that it seems kind of like stream of consciousness. Like Jesus might need a little Ritalin or something. Like he's having an ADD day because it's like, where are you? Hello. Having taught for a lot of years, I know a lot of students and adults who are like this. It's like, okay. Um, but but if we put it all together and we think, big picture about what is Jesus talking about here? Okay, not being a stumbling block to those who want to follow, to those who believe, and there are consequences if one is a stumbling block. Then it's interesting that word stumble gets repeated. If your hand causes you to stumble, and we don't really think of our hands causing us to stumble. I stumble over my feet all the time, but not my hands. So, what is that talking about? The hand and the foot and the eye imagery. What is that asking people to do?
You can tie this back to, when Jesus was healing the child and the father said, "Help me have faith."
I believe, help my unbelief, right?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And, Jesus, I come back to the fact that Jesus is telling you have one priority.
Mm-hmm.
And, that is to live the life God meant you to live. And everything else is secondary, and anything that causes you. And this is consistent with, kind of the most spiritual disciplines, the war between the world and the spirit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Jesus knows where he's come down, and he's trying to convince you to come down on his side.
Mm-hmm. And this language is obviously very extreme. And we haven't necessarily heard such extremity from Jesus up until this point. But again, we're getting to that point where the cross is starting to loom large. In Mark 11, he's going to enter Jerusalem. So we're getting there. And so, he's starting to talk more, I would maybe apocalyptically about, we've got to, the stakes are high, friends. And so, what is it that's getting in the way of you following me? And don't you get in the way of my mission and the mission of the one who sent me. Because, the kingdom of God is at hand. So, keeping all of that in mind, when Jesus talks about salt, everyone will be salted with fire. If we think about fire potentially as cleansing or purifying, okay, there will be this time of purification. But then the rest of that paragraph, salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness, how can you season it? Have salt in yourselves. What does he mean by that?
Could we continue the metaphor by substituting fire for salt there? Fire is good, but if fire has lost its warmth, what use is it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's heat.
It's warmth, it's heat, it's fiery nature. Mm-hmm.
I have a question about the phrase "the salt of the earth" and referring to a good person as the salt of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to know where that comes from, and just for us to remember that salt was very essential
I-
to life in those times.
Exactly.
Because they,
I can answer that because I have my gospel parallels open. And Matthew says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be?" And goes on with this particular one. This one on salt being good, and if it's lost its taste, also appears in Luke. So it makes you think that this is a saying of Jesus, the last one.
Mm-hmm.
But neither of those two tie it to the fire. And they pick this up, Matthew's got it tied right to the paragraph that is above. That paragraph also appears in Matthew and Luke, but in totally different places. So Matthew has Mark has sort of taken the fire and tied it into salt, and then put on Jesus's teaching about salt is good.
Does anyone repeat the phrase, everyone will be salted with fire, making that link?
No, the other two, because it doesn't follow
Because they don't.
any discussion. And neither of them has the have salt in yourself and be at peace with one another.
That may be a mistranslation or a miscommunication of you are the salt of the earth.
I seem to remember, maybe it's the King James version, if salt has lost its savor
Mm-hmm.
rather than saltiness. If your faith has lost its, its ability to uplift and, remake you.
Right. And that's where both Matthew and Luke add in when it's no longer good for anything, then you throw it on the dung heap and trample it under your feet and that sort of stuff, which is consistent with
Yeah,
what
I would say other spices, pepper might, if it's old enough, it sort of loses its pepperiness.
Mm-hmm.
Salt is sort of an essential chemical rather than.
Well, the other piece of it is, as N.T. Wright points out, that salt can be what am I trying to say? Rendered impure with impurities. That's redundant, I realize. But
Okay.
that salt, and he says especially salt from the Dead Sea, can have other things in it and not be
Correct.
pure. So if we think about the essential, to Donna's point about how essential salt is as a preservative, as for flavor, to purify, then you start to think about, okay, well, what is it that is potentially, again, getting in the way of salt's mission? What does it mean for salt to, that should still be in Mark 9, for salt to lose its saltiness. And so when Jesus says, have salt in yourselves, so what does it mean to be salty people? Now, in our lexicon these days, if someone is salty, it means that they're in a bad mood or they're grumpy about something, but I don't think that's quite how Jesus means it.
Curmudgeon.
They're curmudgeon. I do like that. So and so is salty today. What does it mean? What does Jesus want? I guess is my question.
Could that be the preservative effect of salt? To have the salt in yourself be preserved in your faith and be at peace with one another?
Mm-hmm.
I always thought if salt has lost its saltiness, it's simply a reflection of how unique, which is a dreadful phrase, salt is. I mean, there's nothing that will replace salt. I mean, you can use potassium and stuff like that these days, but sodium chloride, as you say, Patty, was essential. It's essential to human life. And there is nothing that can replace it. Therefore, Jesus is saying that this is the, what I think is that he's saying that this is he describes as salt the essence of deep faith and permanent faith.
Well, he says salt is good. I mean,
Mhm.
it's an equivalency.
Mhm.
Salt is your goodness. And I guess maybe the paragraph before, to me, it seems as though the hellfires are threatening people.
Mhm.
I mean, he's threatening them with hellfires if you make mistakes in your life and you're distracted and you're not um, you don't have your mind on the kingdom of God, then you may go to hell. And be good. Salt is good, and
Mhm.
retain your goodness. Make that as an essential part of your nature.
Mhm.
If Jesus' faith was what leavened his life and gave it meaning and satisfaction and, gave him, you know, everything, then if, he says he's saying to hold on to that.
Mhm.
Mm.
Because there's no replacement for it.
Mhm.
Yeah. There is no replacement for that particular, form of salt.
Mhm. And I'm so glad you used the word leaven, Fred, because thinking about, and we talked about this earlier in Mark, the call to be leaven in the world, right? So what does leaven do? What is
Makes
leaven? What's a synonym for leaven?
Yeast.
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 Okay. So what does yeast do in the world?
It
Makes
makes
you rise.
Mhm.
it rise. Yeah.
So it's a catalyst, right? It's transformative. Um, and there we go. Ray had to go, by the way, because he is having, in fact, I think he just sent a note
Mm.
as a doctor's appointment, so he had to go. Um, so, leaven is a catalyst. It transforms, it changes things. And again, Jesus is ramping up his expectations of what it means to be a follower. So it's interesting when we go back to that language, that harsh language, about your hand and your foot and your eye. If it causes you to stumble, better for you to enter life maimed than to go to hell to the unquenchable fire. I hear that, and this may not be accurate, but this is just how I'm hearing it, that it's not so much that we'll be cast into the unquenchable fire, but stumbling suggests to me that we're going to fall into that fire. Gehenna actually is a reference to a trash heap, a dump, a fire pit, right outside the old city of Jerusalem. So there was a physical place, and so where it was just constantly burning and smoldering and all of that. So it may be more that this will happen to us. We're going to fall into this if we're not careful. um, and again, the stakes are high. There's so much good that can be done, that should be done. There's a war on. I want you to help me with sabotage, um, but you can't get distracted by these other things. Anything else about salt or fire or leaven or any of this? Okay, then let's see if we can make a little bit of progress into chapter 10, which is another really long chapter. So, as I said in my email this morning, I knew that we wouldn't get through all of 10, but it'd be nice to get a little bit into 10. Would someone like to read this first section for us? I have a feeling we'll have a lot to say about this. Verses 1 through 12.
Oh, sure.
Thank you, Fred.
Jesus then left that place and went into the region of Judea and across the Jordan. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. Some of the Pharisees came and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" "What did Moses command you?" he replied. They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law, Jesus replied. But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. When they were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. He answered, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery.
Thank you. All right, before we delve into this, I just, you know me, whoops, that's not what I wanted. Wrong thing. Oh, where did it go?
Mhm.
That's not it either. There it is. Okay, sorry. Let me just do our map so we can locate ourselves. So last week, in the past couple of weeks, we've been up in the Galilee, right, for the transfiguration and the subsequent healings and teachings. And then now Mark tells us that Jesus leaves that place, which is to say, leaves the Galilee and goes down into Judea, down in the south. And of course, we can see Jesus is getting ever closer to Jerusalem. And it says Judea and the Jordan. There's the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, Qumran. Who lived down here?
John the Baptist.
Ah, okay. Hold that in your, just let's hold that in the back of our heads, because we're now in the territory of where John the Baptist was teaching. What happened to John the Baptist?
Decapitated.
Lost his head.
He lost his head in more ways than one, quite literally, probably figuratively too. Why?
Jealousy.
Whose jealousy?
He made Herod's wife unhappy.
Yeah.
Because she had married Herod, and she'd been married to his brother before,
Correct.
something like that.
Correct. Exactly right. Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. There's no sense here that Philip had died, right? And so this is not the case where it was the brother's responsibility to take care of the widow of his brother. There's very clearly a moral implication here that Philip and Herodias had gotten a divorce, and then Herodias had gone on to marry King Herod. So keep all of that in our heads as Jesus goes down into Judea, into the land of John the Baptist, and is confronted by the Pharisees who test him. So what's going on here?
Could the Pharisees have been trying to create another John the Baptist moment for Jesus?
Oh, could very well be. Could very well be. How do you all react to this passage? I mean, pastorally, I will say, as a priest, this is always a difficult passage. Every congregation I've ever served, there have been folks who've gone through divorce, which is human. It happens. Human relationships fail. And how do we hold this up without saying you're a bad person because you've gone through a divorce? What do you all think about this?
It was easier when your life expectancy was 30.
Mhm.
You can hang in there for 30 years, or well, obviously not 30
Well,
years, but a few
But then
years.
you married young, so
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
15 years.
What else? What else do you hear here? So to Fred's point, the Pharisees are at it again. This is not the first time we've seen them kind of skulking around saying, okay, let's see if we can entrap him. Let's provoke him to saying something that's going to get him into trouble. And of course, Jesus classically, first response, what does he do? He answers the question with a question. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Well, what did Moses say?
This kind of reminds me of the originalist arguments on the Supreme Court. And I mean, the whole thing, I mean, a lot of learned men and women can interpret a situation very differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are people here kind of being disputing things and just kind of making arguments for the sake of argument. They want their.
Oh, that I think is a good point.
They're playing, kind of.
Yeah, I have this image of them poking the bear, right? Let's see what we can do. Let's see what we can get him to say. So Jesus says, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And then Jesus goes on to quote that language. Where does this come from? God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become. Genesis. So going back, right, to this idealized understanding of God's intention for creation to be partnered and to live in this covenantal relationship. Notice that all of that conversation happens outdoors. The crowds are gathering around him. The Pharisees are provoking him. This is a very public moment. That changes in verse 10. Then in the house, the disciples again asked him about this matter. And Jesus says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Likewise, if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So what do you notice? What do you observe? What do you wonder about?
This is more a modern interpretation of marriage than what it would have been back in his day, when marriage was an economic transaction joining families and kingdoms and merchants and
Well,
it's also,
go ahead, Ellie.
It's also very different from what seems to be the dominant culture in the world now, than that is that the woman becomes the man's possession instead of the other way around, or the man's family.
So there's more equity here. Is that what you're hearing?
No, I'm just saying I'm wondering why there's such a how the culture managed to leap so differently. I mean, is he being more equitable? I mean, is he saying really no, that the man starts his own family, he doesn't stay in his? I don't know.
I think
anyway,
back then when you
decided.
married as a teenager, teenagers haven't changed that much. They're still repelled by their parents. The only difference is you're now married.
Looking from experience, Fred.
Been there on both sides of it.
But since I'm, I think, the only one on who has been divorced,
Me.
one
you're not alone.
Okay. The last part about God made man should do it one flesh, therefore what God is, that could be, that's the way it should be. That's aspirational, but
yes,
Moses said, you're human. And for that reason, God, gave you this right, or not, or he gave Moses the ability to undo marriages. The second part, I'm less sure about, because that is in Matthew, he says, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity, has an exception in there, but this one doesn't. And I think in Luke picks up this as a saying of Jesus and just says flat, this is it. There's no exception. So I don't know how to read the last part
Okay.
when they went into the house. Maybe somebody else has a explanation.
But it does sound that when in the house, he just reiterates the same thing, only more forcefully. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Ellie.
My mother having been twice divorced, the second time it was complicated. But when she became engaged to my stepfather, she was at that time quite spiritual and was having trouble with this, don't divorce, having already divorced. She decided that what God has joined together, let no one separate. And therefore, her first marriage really wasn't valid because they didn't stay together. And so it didn't matter that she had divorced my father because they weren't the true God joining that she and my stepfather were. She was really good at that.
Like that Kennedy annulment after several children.
Yeah.
I would have asked Jesus, what happens if you have been one flesh, but then you separate again? If you are no longer one flesh, are you allowed to divorce?
Well, what does Jesus do? So, the Pharisees, going back to what you said earlier, Fred, about, the Pharisees trying to arrange another John the Baptist moment here. And, if Jesus comes out and says, yes, it's lawful this is one of those catch-22s, because if he says, yes, it's lawful to divorce your wife, then he's going to run afoul of the Jewish authorities, right? Potentially, maybe. If he says, no, it's not lawful, then he could be seen as speaking out against Herod and wind up with his head on a platter. So there's that. But then in the house privately, when he's instructing the disciples, he says, whoever divorces his wife commits adultery. Likewise, if she divorces her husband, she commits adultery. Let's back up, though. And this may not really be fair, but pastorally I do this. What does Jesus say to the woman who is found in adultery in John's gospel? What response does he give when people come, bring the woman before him and say, this woman has been found in adultery?
But he is without sin.
Yeah. Jesus's response is one of mercy, not one of fire and brimstone. And notice here, after verse 12, he doesn't go on to say, that doesn't mean that you're going to fall into Gehenna, into the unquenchable fire where the worm never dies. He simply, it's matter of fact, okay, yes, and to John's point, that may not be God's vision for humanity. God may and I believe that God intends, hopes, dreams that we will enter into lifelong faithful relationships. And at the same time, we're human, right? And so I hear a lot of grace actually here, because he doesn't condemn it. He names it and it doesn't condemn it.
I just want to point out that in chapter 9, he was saying, if your hand offends you, cut it off. So, it seems as though you have Jesus, Jesus talking in two different styles.
Mm-hmm.
That in the story like with the woman at the well and the adulteress story that you were just bringing up, you have somebody who is practicing a very humanistic approach.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also have these words very absolute, and even you have to wonder, is this hyperbole
Mm-hmm.
that he's engaging in when he says, if your foot offends you, cut it off? Um,
I
you
think
know,
it gives me at least a little shiver if you're going to move from if your foot offends you, cut it off to adultery. But Patty, I have to disagree. Jesus does condemn it, unless you're saying he tolerates adultery. Adultery was a major sin back then,
I
at least for women.
I
For
know
men,
that.
it wasn't so bad.
I know that. And what is Jesus's response to that sin? Go and sin no more. He's not saying, go live a licentious life, go, live it up. But there is mercy. There's grace there. That's all I'm saying. And so, this is a Jesus who, yes, there is the aspiration of God. There is God's perfect vision. And Jesus is all about bringing about God's vision for the world. And at the same time, there is room for grace. There's plenteous grace. Which,
Jesus was never about justice. He was always about mercy.
right, precisely.
I mean, I guess I would see this, he's saying this is a violation of one of the commandments,
Mm-hmm.
but he doesn't then say, and you go straight to hellfire at that point.
Correct.
If God, if you take the Lord's name in vain, I'd be in big trouble,
Mm-hmm.
because, we thank God there is mercy and I control myself most of the time.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly it. It doesn't negate the law, it doesn't negate the commandment. At the same time, the consequences are not hellfire and brimstone. Um, and that's, we've talked about this before. You've heard me say sin is not a four-letter word. I mean, literally it's not a four-letter word, but it's also, yes, as humans we sin. The and being sinners doesn't mean that we're cast out. It means that we have the opportunity to amend our lives, to try again, to work toward healing and restoration. And that's where grace comes in, that it's not just you're out. So, but this is, it seems to me, and I have no data to back this up at all, but it seems to me that when I want to go back to what Donna said about, Jesus speaking in two different ways, and the whole business about the hand and the foot and the eye is very hyperbolic, and it's in a context about, what's getting in the way of your discipleship. But that kind of language gets pulled out of context all the time. And that's that fire and brimstone understanding of Jesus and of Christianity and what God's will is for us. And it's so harsh. The passages about grace and mercy, I don't think get pulled out as often. And again, no data to back that up at all. It's just a sense. And why is it that, it's easier for some folks to focus on that harshness than to get their heads and hearts around grace? And that, I don't have an answer to that question. That's sort of been my life's work, trying to make sense of it for myself in my own life of sin. And I think that's true for each of us. We got to come to terms with how we understand the love of God. Someone was going to say something and I kept babbling on. I'm sorry. No? Anything else there before we push on?
Well, I have a concern
Okay.
that it always strikes me as very strange that Jesus and the disciples all these guys together and they travel around, and we know that, was it James and John leave their families? So,
Mhm.
I mean, logically, we know they didn't just come flying out of the earth, they come from families, but you never get any word about wives. And yet it was the Jewish standard that you had to take a wife. You had to have sons and daughters. And so to me, it's a very odd situation.
That's wonderful. Oh, great. What do you all think about that?
Well, Amy Joe Levine has a sentence here which I could throw in just with Donna's query. Among Jesus' followers, the prohibition of divorce might have addressed those who were separating for celibacy.
Hmm.
And does that include the disciples? It doesn't say so, but I mean, that's the way I read.
Mhm. Mhm.
Bible was written by men, and they had a particular axe to grind in most cases, and women just weren't part of it.
Mhm. Mhm. I think that's why verse 12 here strikes me when I was talking to Ellie about equity, is the fact that Jesus, verses 11 and 12, Jesus says, a man commits adultery if he divorces a woman commits adultery if she divorces her husband. That there's parity there, which wasn't part of the social structure. So I think that's why that jumped out at me.
Sorry, Patty, but according to Jill, at this time, they were practicing Roman law within the Jewish community, and women were allowed to institute divorce in Roman law.
Right. But I guess the larger point is
Initiated.
that women wouldn't have had nearly the same rights culturally, right? And weren't understood as equals. But Jesus, and especially in Luke's gospel, and hopefully one day we'll read Luke together. Luke is always bringing in the women, and Luke has a particular agenda to cast a light on Jesus's preferential love for women. But here, um, what's is there anything else we want to say about this before we push on?
I wanted to answer Donna or
Good, please.
to her point that the women don't show up, but in other gospels, and John, maybe you'll confirm this, and as you say, Patty, Luke does mention the women. It's quite possible that that Mark is simply ignoring the women who traveled with Jesus. I mean, until they come out and wash his feet and weep. But the rest of the time, I don't know if it's their wives and kids or whether it's just supporters. But I think Jesus is being fair about male and female because there were women in the audience. There were women who followed him, and just because they don't show up in Mark doesn't mean they weren't there.
Great point, and that underscores what Fred was saying about, the Gospels were written by men, or at least the canonical Gospels, the ones that made the cut. And so there's a particular agenda, right? But you're right.
It's not even an agenda, but they just overlook them. I mean, they don't count.
They weren't relevant to the story.
But we also know that women were following at a distance, and we certainly know Mary Magdalene was very much a disciple. But we also know what tradition does to her, and turns her into a prostitute and all the stuff that she's not. But there it is. So there are. It's definitely, maybe agenda is too strong a word, but for sure women are edited out of the narrative, but they're there.
Just an attitude.
And yeah, so back to Donna's point, which I think is amazing, this concern that you raised, Donna. What is Jesus, his bigger movement what's it really about? And that's a really big question. But when we think about, when, and I believe it's the Pharisees another time who asked Jesus, suppose a man dies and his wife marries his brother, and then he dies, and, she marries all the brothers. It's like
Mhm.
down the line. Whose wife will she be in the afterlife? And what does Jesus say to that?
There's no marriage in heaven.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it may be, that yes, on earth we have these relationships, and he's broadening it. Because it does fly in the face of that household and the covenantal fidelity that you're talking about. These guys are just leaving. And we know that at least that Peter was married, because there's reference to Peter's mother-in-law being healed in Capernaum. So we don't know about the others necessarily, but the Gospels talk about Peter's. Interesting, they don't talk about Peter's wife, but talk about Peter's mother-in-law. So he had to have been married at some point. What happened to his wife, we don't know.
Well, I think your cartoon, Patty, summed it up nicely. The women find Jesus has risen, and the men show up and say, "Oh, we'll take it from here."
For those, exactly. For those who aren't Facebook friends with me, I will send that cartoon out because it's it's just, the women are the first witnesses to the resurrection, and it's the men who write the story. So there we go. And that's not to sound, I'm not male bashing. It's just that's the way it is. Was.
But you asked what was Jesus, what was he trying to do?
Yeah.
And
Well,
why
yeah,
would
I think that I don't think he was trying to disrupt the family system, but he's not as bound by it, perhaps, in calling these disciples and calling people out of their daily life into a new life, um, that is kingdom focused, that's, focused on his teaching and what he's revealing about God. Um, it's not disrupting the whole system, because obviously we need families in order for the human race to continue. We need men and women to have babies, and we need to have households for them to be raised. And at the same time, Jesus is offering this other mode, I guess I would
I'll come
say.
back to what I have mentioned in the past. There was a point where Jesus is in a house,
Mm-hmm.
and his family is outside trying to get him away from the crowd because they're afraid he'll say something stupid that'll get him.
Exactly. And what does he
And,
say?
they tell Jesus that his family is outside, and Jesus says, "Who are your family?"
Yep.
My family are the people here who believe in me.
Mm-hmm.
And, it ties in nicely with, if your hand offends you, cut it off. If
Yeah.
your family offends you, cut them off.
If they're not on
Persecute,
board,
stumble.
yeah.
If they're not on board, then, they are good. They are a stumbling block for you.
That's a great connection. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. But I don't think that Jesus is rejecting or problematizing the family altogether. And at the same time, for his mission, he needs people who are really focused on him and on the kingdom and on bringing about preaching the good news.
Yeah, but that's pretty much a rejection of family as it would be thought of at those times.
But not universally,
Not
right?
Yeah, just for his
universally,
purpose.
but
Right.
he's
And
just
that's
saying,
right.
family's got, cannot get, you have one major priority,
Mm-hmm.
and you can't even allow family to get in the way.
Mm-hmm. And yet Jesus says here in verses 7 and 8, man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, they become one flesh. So
Now we know that lasts through the honeymoon and maybe the first year.
we won't tell Louise that you've said these. I promise. We just can't let her watch the video, right? We'll just.
Yeah.
um, but well,
Said
yeah.
you're looking for trouble.
But I think Donna, you raised such a good question, because there is this juxtaposition. There's this tension here between, the two becoming one flesh, and being united, being bonded, raising children, and the importance of the household. And for Jesus, he's got this mission, and he calls, and it's not just the 12. We know, then he appoints 70 apostles to go out, and presumably they're leaving behind loved ones. So there is sort of this radical movement. I don't know that his vision is to call everyone away from their household, because again, what would happen to the human race? Um,
The human race is, not a problem because the apocalypse is coming.
True.
Jesus doesn't say it is.
Yes, he does. He says earlier in Mark that there are some in this generation that will not taste death.
Yep.
But look at that in a different way, from a different perspective.
I'm sort of thinking you have to take the plain reading of things. Otherwise, the whole thing becomes meaningless.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Plain reading in context. I guess I would just add that. And understanding or looking at what else is mitigating there.
Yeah.
Clearly, Jesus, and going back to the C.S. Lewis quote about, the rightful king has landed on the beach and is, engaging in this mission of sabotage to turn things upside down. That's for sure apocalyptic imagery. And I think that's exactly what Mark is about, right? Is that Jesus has landed, and, the kingdom is coming. And so the stakes are high. So, there isn't a lot of time to linger and dither and wonder, well, shall I stay or shall I go? He expects that, and it's not going to be for everybody, but for those who do want to be part of this movement, to use the presiding bishop's language about the Jesus movement, for those who do want to be part of this movement, it's about commitment, and it's about being salty and, doing all those things that he calls them to do.
But Jesus does it on top of the Jewish traditions and rules. I mean, he doesn't say, get behind me, I don't want to, it's a whole new game. He does it, he embraces that.
Yep.
Which, I mean, it's, to me, Jesus is, what he wants to do is extremely spiritual, and to reconcile men and women to God, and to have them have a shot at an afterlife, but it's all on top of the Jewish tenets.
Well, Jesus does say he wouldn't change one letter of the law, but he ignores the law whenever it's inconvenient.
Well, I think inconvenient might be a little bit of a cynical word there, but
well, when they're walking through the fields and they're taking the sheaves and eating them,
right?
They could have stopped and waited and put them in their pockets and waited till they got somewhere. Or I mean, on the one hand, if you're the Son of God, you maybe can cut yourself a little slack.
Well, that's why I think the word inconvenient is a little cynical, because that sounds like Jesus plays fast and loose, and I don't think he does that. I think
he does on occasion.
Well, but who is Jesus? That's the question. I mean, it's not, it's not.
I mean, if his rules don't apply to us, how are we able then to, take meaning? How are we able to interpret what he said?
With limitations, the rules have limitations.
And Jesus is reinterpreting and revealing for humankind what, Jesus in many ways is offering a corrective to the ways in which the Pharisees in particular have gotten so hung up on the jot and tittle of the law that they fail to see the big picture. And that's where I go back to that ethic of grace and mercy. That yes, the commandment says, thou shalt not commit adultery. And at the same time, Jesus doesn't say you'll be cast into the unquenchable fire for it. So I think that's how we understand all of this, because there is a tension between the Jewish law and Jesus doesn't, throw it all out. Of course not. He does help people to reinterpret it and understand it in light of this God of grace. That, people often say, well, the God of the Old Testament is so different from the God of the New Testament. It's two different gods. The way I make sense of that is that no, it's that the Old Testament was written by humans interpreting life as they understood it, and then Jesus reveals more about God. And Christianity teaches that Jesus is the fullest revelation of who God is. And that makes sense to me. So it's a matter of giving us new eyes to see things differently. And that's why these kinds of conversations are so rich, because we have to, wrestle it out together.
I gotta
I think
say,
we're
God,
almost at the end of time, but with my gospel parallels in front of me, Matthew immediately after this, at Matthew 10, and maybe everybody should look at it and help interpret it, because it's where Jesus, the disciples say, well, gee, I better marry, or it's not a good idea to marry. And Jesus says, no, there are eunuchs. There are eunuchs who were eunuchs from birth, eunuchs who were made, and eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And I think that may be, Patty, your concept, that in the full pursuit of the kingdom of heaven, you almost rise above the man and woman relationships, the Jewish tradition of family or whatever. You give yourself entirely to the kingdom of heaven.
Which is, what was the reference in Matthew, John? What verse?
Matthew 19, verse 10.
Ah, Matthew 19. Okay. And I'll just say that, that's not for everybody, right? Not everyone can do that. There we go. Not everyone can accept this teaching, but only to those to whom it is given.
By whom?
By whom? Who's giving it? I would say by God, that there's a particular calling. And even if we think about our own context now, even in the 21st century, there are religious communities, there are people who are called to live separately from the rest of society, and commit themselves to prayer and communal living and service. But that's not everybody's call. And so I think, one does not negate the other. It's a both and.
Yeah.
What?
We have to stop there, huh?
What was that, Elin? I'm sorry.
I think I'll have to stop there.
Yeah, we all have to stop.
We all have to. I'm sorry to prolong it.
No, you didn't prolong it at all. I knew that this would be a rich conversation about this section on teaching about divorce, and we can pick it up next time there, because I think it's something for us to be thinking about, praying about, talking about, when the law comes smack up against God's grace, what do we do? How do we understand that? And there are so many, tension points in scripture where that happens. How do we interpret it? So, I mean, that's the bigger question that I think has been raised here, and it's a great one.
Well, it's almost three parts. It's the law and God's grace and humans.
Reality.
Yeah, yep, that's exactly right. The lived experience as human beings in the world. That, going back to what John said before about that vision in Genesis, that's aspirational, that's the ideal. And we know that as humans, we fall short of that all the time. It's not a get out of jail free card. It's a recognition, and St. Paul would say, what then? Sin more so that grace may abound? By no means, so we're constantly fighting against that. Like, okay, there's God's expectation and hope for us, vision for us. There's human nature. And then I think grace is what moves between those two. Well, Howard, thank you for being with us. I hope you'll come back again.
I will. This is most of this is brand new for me, and it's way over my head. So I have to do some reading.
Well, and you and and I know Ray is happy to companion you on this as well. Happy to have conversation, coffee, talk about any of this at any point. Just
I-
jump in and join us because we are so glad you're here.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, dear ones, I'm going to